Good day, good evening, Dobry den, dobry večer. My name is Nadia McConnell. I'm president of the U.S.-Ukraine Foundation, and it is my deep pleasure and honor to welcome two friends and colleagues, Paul Goble and David Kramer, for our discussion today. This has been quite an extraordinary month that's just passed us. We had the Kakhovka Dam explosion, which was destroyed by the Russians on June the 6th. We had the Prigozhin June 23rd mutiny. Then we were dealing with the threats of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant being blown up by the Russians. And by the way, we had an excellent webinar on Monday with General Ben Hodges and Yuri Kostenko, former Minister of the Environment, on this topic. And we should have it up either today or tomorrow. It was quite a sobering and important discussion. And then, of course, the last few days, Vilnius. It is really challenging to keep up. I think any one of these topics is deserving of a lot of commentary and understanding how it fits into the overall situation. And there have been a lot of comments and articles written by some people who know something about these things, and then some people who think they know something about these things. So if I might say, so we want to first start out with the discussion about what took place in Vilnius. And not only in terms of its results regarding Ukraine, but I think in terms of what we saw in the dynamics of the NATO alliance. So I'm going to turn to Paul first. And Paul, rather than my trying to read through your extraordinary biography, and the fact that you have been an active participant in many of the important events of the last, 30, 40 years, I think it's important for our audience to appreciate your body of work and from where you are really positions to make some of these comments. And one of the questions I would pose to you in terms of the role that we're seeing the Baltics, and of course, particularly Lithuania, play by, first of all, hosting the Vilnius summit, but also in terms of how it has developed into a strategic and equal partner in the leadership or discussions within the NATO alliance. And Paul, you were there in Lithuania before they declared independence. As you reminded, they declared independence in 1918. But when you look at Wikipedia, it's noted as March 1990 is their Independence Day. So Paul, first let's talk about what's happened with the Baltics and specifically Lithuania in this whole discussion of NATO.
50 years ago, when I first got involved in the study of the non-Russian part of what was the Russian Empire, the Baltic deputies were a joke. If you read fiction about this part of the world, Baltic deputies were equivalent to saying the irrelevant. Nobody was going to pay attention to them. The three Baltic peoples, the Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, captured the imagination of the world in 1989, 1991, because of the way in which they proceeded to push things forward, first for themselves, but then for all of the peoples of the region. Since 91, at that time, I was working on Baltic affairs at the State Department and was an advisor to the Secretary on the non-Russians. Since that time, I've had an opportunity to watch as all three of these nations and their governments have clawed their way into positions of enormous influence. In 1992, everybody was sort of saying, well, you got your independence, now you can be quiet. But since that time, they've managed to get into the European Union, they've managed to get into NATO. But more important than that, they've established themselves as primary sources for information and judgment about what's going on to the East and how the West should respond. It's not just that they're in NATO, it's they're in NATO as major players. They can speak with authority about what it is to live under Russian rule, because they lived under Russian rule and they have reason to not want that to happen again and to oppose it in other cases. I was just thinking before we went on the air that 33 years ago, we were having Captive Nations Day, Captain Nations Week commemorations in July, and the three Baltic countries and Ukraine were part of the parade of nations. This year, Ukraine is having a Captive Nations Week commemoration in Kiev with members of the Ukrainian government. The Estonians, Latvians, and Lithuanians are no longer captive nations. They've taken themselves in the front rank of the free nations of the world. And those of us who've been involved at the margins of that, and I don't want to take anything away from the peoples of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, are extraordinarily pleased and proud that this had happened, because quite frankly, with the passing of some of the great leaders of the old Eastern Europe over the last decade, the Estonian, Latvian, and especially Lithuanian leadership have become the new spokesman for extending the values of Europe rather than sitting on our laurels, which is what I'm afraid status quo countries always have a tendency to want to do.
Thank you, Paul, for that. And if I might say, I think we're all better for it to see this dynamic maturing of the strategic role that the Baltics, and then of course, people have also written that Poland also is now, if you want to say, in the leadership position. David, I'm going to turn to you now and ask you to talk about how you view what took place in Vilnius. And I guess particularly if you would kind of, again, review for us your biography, in the sense that you were there, right, in 2008 for the Bucharest summit. And what a difference we see, particularly if we look at the role that the US played then, or perhaps, and what it didn't play this time around. I suppose I'm prejudging the answer here, but David, please.
Great. Well, thanks, Nadia, and it's great to be back with Paul here. I'll just actually build very quickly on what Paul was saying, just to highlight the critical role the Baltic states are playing actually globally, not just in the region. Lithuania is standing up to China, asserting support for Taiwan and coming under the wrath of the Communist Party in Beijing. And all three, I think, have been pushing all the other countries in NATO, including the United States, to be better allies. And so they've really done a stellar job. And I think Lithuania absolutely deserved to host this summit. And it was great to see. I think the NATO summit was a mixed bag. Wednesday was better than Tuesday. Tuesday provided frustration to President Zelensky. We saw this play out on social media when he described the communique that was issued as unprecedented and absurd. He particularly disliked this phrase in the communique on paragraph 11, which says, "The alliance will support Ukraine in making these reforms on its path towards future membership. We will be in a position to extend an invitation to Ukraine to join the alliance when allies agree and conditions are met." That doesn't say when Ukraine will become a member. It doesn't say what the conditions are. I think if any country has met the conditions of joining NATO, Ukraine is at the front of the line. We seem to be holding Ukraine to different conditions and requirements before joining the NATO alliance. The issue of corruption has been raised, including by President Biden. There are some countries in NATO that could do a lot better on the issue of corruption. And Ukraine has made, I think, real strides on this issue. But there is no country in NATO that has the experience that Ukraine has in fighting invading Russian forces. And so I think we're at a point now where, frankly, NATO would be lucky to have Ukraine as a member, and Ukraine does deserve membership. The administration balked at moving forward because it feared escalation from Russia. and it feared that it would be drawn into a direct conflict with Russia if it provided Article 5 security guarantees. And he just look at what Jake Sullivan said, I think it was yesterday, when he was challenged by Daria Kalanyuk, a Ukrainian activist at the NATO Public Forum. And she said, what do I tell my 2-year-old son? Is the United States afraid of Russia? And he said, Sullivan said in response, the president said quite simply that he's not prepared to have Ukraine in NATO now because it would mean that the United States and NATO would be at war with Russia now. Well, let me just say, we are at war with Russia now. It is American and British and German bullets and missiles and other weapons that are firing at Russian forces. And while we maybe have not declared war on Russia, we are providing the means for the Ukrainians to not only defend themselves, but to go on the offensive and hopefully to win this war. The contrast you were getting at, Nadia, in 2008, of course, President Bush was trying to push for a membership action plan for both Ukraine and Georgia, and ran into resistance from France and Germany. And the result was a communique that said Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO. It didn't say when, didn't say how. Here we are 15 years later, and Ukrainians are frustrated with the lack of progress they have seen toward accession. And in this case, in this go around, we saw the United States and Germany act as the brakes on a more forthcoming statement coming out of the alliance. And as a result, we saw that line that I just read in the communique. Wednesday was better, though. President Biden expressed his full support for Ukraine. And I think maybe lost in all the discussion about membership or not membership was an indication from President Biden that the U.S. may finally, belatedly, may be ready to provide ATACMS, these longer range weapons, missile systems for Ukraine, which the Ukrainians desperately need. And so if that also is a result of the NATO summit, of President Zelensky's push for more assistance, that will be a positive outcome. But it's a mixed bag overall, I would say. And I hope that next year, when the NATO summit is held in Washington, that the alliance will be ready to welcome Ukraine in as a member, not just announce that Ukraine will become a member at X uncertain date, but actually to formally welcome in Ukraine. Last thing I'll say very quickly, sorry for going on, is it is positive that Finland became a member. Hopefully Sweden will, once the Turkish parliament votes to ratify Swedish membership. And so as a result of this, the border between NATO and Russia has, I think, roughly doubled with Finland's joining. And with Sweden joining, I mean, you have a huge swath of territory now in the Scandinavian region that will be members of NATO. So this is not a good outcome for President Putin. And hopefully once Ukraine joins, it will solidify even more how the alliance is standing up against him.
Paul, before I turn to you, I need to pick up, I think, on a couple of things, David, that you said at the very beginning, that it seems, and we have seen this throughout these decades, that the goalpost gets moved on many issues. I mean, it's always a moving goalpost of what it is that Ukraine needs to achieve before X, Y, or Z. Regarding the package of additional assistance, we had a discussion with General Ben Hodges, and he reminded us that it really shouldn't be an either or, that the supplying of additional weapons that Ukrainians need is not really a substitute for a decision by the NATO alliance. I don't know if you want to comment about that.
Well, no, there's no question that we should be doing both. We should be moving toward Ukrainian membership in NATO, and at the same time, we should accelerate the provision of military assistance to Ukraine. There has been a lot done for Ukraine, and there were these comments by certain Western officials saying the Ukrainians should express gratitude for what the West has done. That didn't sit too well with the Ukrainians, although they seem to have listened. Zelensky went out of his way yesterday to express thanks to the United States and others. So we have done a lot, but there has been, I think, a frustrating pattern where the Ukrainians ask for certain weapon systems, we say no. They ask again, we say maybe. They ask again, and we finally say yes. And in the process of that delay and dithering, Ukrainians are getting killed. And so we need to accelerate the decision-making process in providing the weapon systems that the Ukrainians need yesterday, not what they'll need in the future. The whole issue about F-16s, the comment from Jake Sullivan was the Ukrainians don't need them now. This was back earlier this year. Well, I actually think they did need them back then, but they certainly need them now. And if they had made the decision to provide them earlier this year or even last year, the Ukrainians could be deploying them right now as part of their counteroffensive. The same thing with ATACMS. And so we need to be more forward thinking in our decision-making approach when it comes to weapons assistance, while at the same time working toward bringing Ukraine into NATO. These definitely are not mutually exclusive.
Some of what you're talking about makes me think about two very recent, I think, excellent pieces by Gary Kasparov. Well, I think one of them was titled "Why the U.S. Ditters, Ukrainians Are Dying." This is, I think people need to perhaps remember that it's more than just about sort of sitting around conference tables and negotiating language. There are people who are actually dying every single day, because of what decisions are made or not made. Paul, I'm going to now turn to you, because one of the things I have asked you to do sometime in the near future, and I'll announce to our audience that you, in fact, I think it was in 2011, we had you do what you were doing then, where you were telling the story of the history of the Soviet Union by anecdotes for the different decades. And for those that may not know this, President Reagan was always including jokes and anecdotes regarding the Soviet Union. And you were the one responsible for providing him these different jokes. And I recall you saying that sometimes he'd call you and say, "Paul, I really like this joke, but I can't do it in public." Recently, in your pieces, you have started again. So let me finish. So we hope that in the very near future, we're going to ask you to do this history of the Soviet Union, but then also bringing it up to date about what's going on in Russia today. And you have started again in your pieces, including some of these anecdotes about what's going on. I don't believe there's any other country where anecdotes have played such a critical role in where people are expressing their dissatisfaction with what's going on within with their government. They're not allowed necessarily to protest in the streets but it seems that they get their messages through anecdotes. And can you share with us? I think you were sharing with me earlier, particularly one that is now appearing post Vilnius.
Before I do that, I just feel I've got to make a comment on what David said, because I think there's one aspect that we miss, and I think if we miss it, we're making a big mistake. Putin's goal from the beginning has been to break NATO, to split it into pieces. The process of bringing the entire alliance along, and it gets more complicated the more countries are in it, requires a lot of zigzagging. I've been in favor of Ukrainian membership in NATO since 1991. So we should have admitted them a long time ago. Having said that, the strength of NATO has always been that it isn't somebody giving an order and everybody else saluting, as was true in the Warsaw Pact. It's bringing along everyone. And then when everyone comes along, the alliance is stronger once it makes a decision rather than weaker. I take from Vilnius the fact, and I think David is exactly right to point to the difference between day one and day two, that there was movement. Not only did the alliance not fracture over Finland or Sweden, the way Mr. Putin and many others expected. Not only did it not fraction over an action plan for Ukraine in the short term and Ukraine NATO Council and all kinds of things, but there was more support for that at the end than at the beginning. I believe that the most important thing to say about Vilnius is, while a lot of us regret Ukraine wasn't invited in, it should have been, in my view, is that the alliance is stronger today than it was a week ago. And it's stronger because there was movement toward an agreement. Would it be better if it were faster? Absolutely. But is it better that the alliance works as a group of democratic countries that engage in a messy kind of politics moving forward? I think so. And I just want to underline that what Vilnius showed was that the alliance works best when everybody is moving along as they have been. I have no doubt that if not in Washington, then in the very next year, Ukraine will be invited to join NATO as a full member. But it will be invited by all the members of NATO, not because the United States wanted it or because some other country didn't want it, whatever. The entire alliance is moving. And that's very difficult to do, but it's been achieved in Vilnius. And I think I at least want to make sure we underline that, because I think that's been missed in an awful lot of the commentary. They ignored the fact that Putin's goal has not been just to take Ukraine, but to break NATO apart, to break NATO, to break the North Atlantic Alliance, the Europeans and the Americans, to split them apart. What happened at Vilnius was a resounding no to that Putin goal. And the alliance is stronger because that's happened. If things haven't gone as fast as some of us would like, that's true. But have more steps been taken in the right direction by more members of the alliance than ever before is also true. And I suspect that the boys and girls in the basements of the Kremlin, which seems to be where they all live now, are not happy about it. They would have been much happier if there had been a split caused by any number of possibilities. It didn't happen. So for me, while I regret Ukraine wasn't taken in nearly 30 years ago, what's more important is that the alliance is stronger than it was a week ago. And that's to the credit of a lot of people, including the 3 Baltic countries we've been talking about. I'm sorry, I just had to throw that in.
Okay.
Let
So,
me
yes,
let me add that. Let me give you 3 of the most recent political jokes, anecdotes coming out of Moscow, having to do with Ukraine and the East-West struggle. Not because they're necessarily the best, but because they're the ones that come to mind. And I'll look forward to doing a more formal presentation of a larger group at some point in the future. The first, which I learned of only today, it goes as follows: that Putin has achieved great things. He's managed to get Sweden and Finland into NATO. He didn't quite succeed, Russians say, in getting Ukraine in, but he's put them on a path so they're going to get in easier. One of the reasons Russians say things like that as anecdotes is because sometimes a cigar is only a cigar, and you're less likely to get to count trees in Siberia if you say it that way than if you say it more bluntly. Second anecdote, which comes from 2 days ago, is Alexander Prokhanov, the firebrand Russian nationalist, goes fishing and he captures the magic goldfish. Russians are always capturing magic goldfish, which promise them anything they want as long as the fisherman throws the goldfish back in. So Prokhanov says, well, what I want is for my country to be the hegemonic power in the world. And the goldfish looks at Prokhanov's back pocket and sees that not only is there a Russian passport there, but there's an American one and a Chinese one. And so the goldfish says, you can throw me back now. Just wait until the war's over in Ukraine, one of your countries is going to be that, which says something else. Another one has to do with going to war and being paid off by these insurance payments that Putin is promising. And what's said is that people say that the money is just flowing like water, which means it's going to be printed and become increasingly worthless. But last one I'll tell today, because it's true. There's only one day a year when Russian environmentalists are happy. That's election day. Do you know why? Because it's the only day that Russians throw waste paper into an urn. Anyway, that's enough. Okay.
Yes. Well, that's a, is it a trailer or preview for?
That's a preview.
Okay.
There are, so far, I've managed to collect about 500 jokes over the last 4 or 5 years. And it's, they're not as perfect as some of the ones of the golden age of the Brezhnev era, but they're awfully good. And I think the fact that people are telling them is a good thing. As one Soviet dissident once said, every political joke is a little revolution. And I think it's changing people's minds and hearts, and that despite everything, a lot is going in the right direction.
Thank you for that. And before I get accused of false advertising, we had labeled this webinar to talk about what's happening within the Russian Federation post Prigozhin's mutiny. When I first called you to talk about that, I did it because there were so many discussions about what all this meant sort of geopolitically, but there was little discussion about what did it mean internally. So I'd like to get to that. Now, David, I recall when I asked you to comment on this, I think one of the things we discussed was this movement of free nations, and you warned me that you, unlike some of our colleagues, did not believe that this was going to weaken or accelerate this move for independence by these other non-Russian communities. And I think I told you I was not looking for a preconceived answer. I just wanted honest discussion on this. But Paul, part of your extraordinary biography is that you have been the nationalities expert. And in fact, I believe you were at one time the only nationalities expert.
Up until 89.
And then I think you resigned because you wanted that, to expand the study of the non-Russian nationality so that we could understand more about what is happening. So Paul, I'm going to start with you in terms of the impact that you think it might have or not at all in terms of some of these movements that you have been tracing for decades with the non-Russian countries. I mean, sometimes when I read your things, I feel like I really need a map because there are so many of them and I have no clue as to where they are. But reading you, I do get a general sense of developments within the Russian Federation, which I think are so very important. And you have been, I guess, a participant in a lot of the summits that have taken place with the group that is calling themselves Free Nations.
Right.
So talk about, again, what did this mutiny have any impact, do you think, on these kinds of developments?
The Prigozhin mutiny
Yes.
had an enormous impact, not just on the non-Russians, but on Russians in the regions as well. It demonstrated beyond any question that the emperor has no clothes. The way in which this played out highlighted Putin's weakness. It showed disorder and chaos in the command. And whenever there's a sense in the periphery, and the periphery starts at the ring road around Moscow, there's a sense that we can challenge the center in ways that there wasn't. Things are happening already in the regions that clearly the center can't be entirely pleased by. I mean, to give you just one example that popped up yesterday, Oriol Oblast, which is not contiguous to Ukraine, is not going to be threatened by Ukrainian gunfire, nonetheless has formed its own militia. Now, if I were sitting in the Kremlin, I wouldn't be especially happy about yet another unit, especially an ethnic Russian unit, forming that. What I see is there's much greater sense that the feelings of many people that this country is in trouble, that it's going to fracture. Whether it completely falls apart depends on a lot of things. My own sense is that it will partially fall apart, but not completely. 91 was a good first step. And I find myself repeating what I said then, which is don't buy any maps. Buy stock in companies that print maps and you'll make money because they're going to change. I personally believe, as I've written, that what we are likely to see in the next 3 or 4 years is something that looks a whole lot more like 1918 than like 1991. 91 was easy. The components were known. In January of 91, even the people who didn't think the Soviet Union would ever fall apart knew that if it did, there would be 15 pieces. Now, no one knows that. And in 91, there was no willingness in the center to use force to keep the place together. A much more likely scenario is going to be something like 1918, where there are going to be a lot of people trying to leave, with the borders and the institutions not clearly defined, but with enough left around the core, that is to say Moscow, willing to use enormous amounts of violence to hold things together. Whether the balance will head toward Moscow or head otherwise depends, it seems to me, on two things. One is the West had better learn the lesson it didn't learn after 1918, which is if you're going to help people, make sure you help them a lot. We managed to help the anti-Bolshevik white movements and the non-Russian movements in the case of the Russian Empire coming apart in 1918, 1919, just enough to allow Lenin to present himself as a kind of Russian patriot, but not enough for those movements to succeed. If we're going to be involved again, we need to make some critical decisions about how much support we're going to give to whom. And it's also true, and this is something that I've been working on in recent years because I think it's critical. Mr. Putin believes, and a lot of Americans do too, that language is the only marker of nationality, that people who speak the same language won't split. This is really hilarious when it comes from Americans who live in a country that was led by people who spoke far better English than George III. And the idea that Russia is a unified place just because it speaks something resembling the same language is, I think, nonsensical. I personally think that the biggest parts of Russia that are likely to achieve independent status in the next year or two are going to be Russian-speaking areas, probably in the Far East and in Siberia, rather than Tatarstan and Bashkortostan, two largest non-Russian republics, which have some real geographic problems in moving out. This is going to be a very messy situation, but to answer your question in brief, everything that makes the center look weak and uncertain, everything that raises questions about what will happen, whether the center can get its act together. I mean, today, or I guess it actually was yesterday, we have a Russian general who's been fired who appeals to his troops against the command. When things like that start happening, people don't believe that the state is an effective entity. I wrote an article almost 20 years ago called Russia is a Failed State. It's a failed state now, but it's important to understand what a failed state is. A failed state is not a territory that has institutions on it that some of which aren't powerful. It may have some institutions which are very powerful. It's a territory on which there is no controlling center. And that's what's increasingly true. Putin no longer has the kind of unquestioned ability to give orders that he did. And the Prigozhin business and how it's ending with Putin negotiating with somebody he said he implied should be shot as a traitor raises real questions about what's going on in the Kremlin. And when people begin asking questions, first they tell jokes, then they take actions. And I think we're in the transition from jokes to action in a whole bunch of places in the territory of the Russian Federation.
Thank you, Paul. Now, David, you have not only, I guess, moved from not thinking that there's going to be a breakup, but on the contrary, I think in your latest article for Bulwark, you argue that in some ways this is going to make Putin stronger in the sense that he will work to restore his power and control. And you talk about some examples in other countries. So, David?
I published a piece 2 days after the mutiny titled More Questions Than Answers. And I have to say, I still have more questions than I do answers about what happened and what it means. The fact that Putin met with Prigozhin and others involved in the mutiny on the 29th kind of baffles me. The fact that Prigozhin never apparently went to Belarus as the agreement struck with Lukashenko suggested would be the case. The fact that Prigozhin is both being given back some money and a pistol and other things that were seized while also being accused of misusing billions and billions of dollars. I don't understand why the Kremlin keeps saying how much money it provided Prigozhin and then says they didn't hold him to account. They have no idea what he did with the money. I agree with Paul that the situation does not strengthen Russia in the sense of making it a better, well-equipped force to fight Ukraine. I think the impact on morale of this whole mutiny will further erode that on the Russian side, which was already low. We see more and more stories of Russian forces laying down their arms, surrendering, running, and I think that's likely to increase. I think for Russian forces on the receiving end of Ukrainian bullets and missiles, they see Prigozhin and his guys get away with a mutiny while they get shot and killed if they try to leave the front. So I think the impact on morale and Russia's ability to fight this war will be significantly negatively affected. And I still hold out the possibility of a sudden Russian military collapse. I do think that if the Ukrainians are able to really launch a major offensive, then we are likely to see an en masse withdrawal of Russian forces, not by order of Putin or Gerasimov or Shoigu, but just because the forces on the ground will have decided they've had enough. That said, I'm not certain that Putin has in fact been weakened by this. There's even a side of me, I'm not a conspiracist, but there's even a side of me that wonders whether this mutiny was a put-up job for Putin to ferret out who's loyal to him and who isn't. We've seen Surovikin basically disappear. It doesn't mean that people will stop criticizing Popov, the general that was just dismissed as an example of somebody who continues to speak out. It's a bizarre situation, and I am struggling to figure out what the fallout is going to be. I think so much is going to depend on how the war plays out, and I think it is critically important that we keep our focus on supporting Ukraine to help it not just defend itself, but to win this war, and then let the Russian chips fall where they may. our main focus, should there be some fracturing of the Russian Federation, I think will undoubtedly be on the control of the nuclear weapons in the country. And you look at the reaction of the Biden administration when the mutiny happened, how quickly it came out and said that we had nothing to do with it. I think if you do see any separatist movements inside the country, we're likely to hear a similar line. I'm not saying that's the right approach or the wrong approach, but I think that will be the policy of the US, which is we will say publicly that we're not involved in this. It's an internal matter. So it still raises with me lots of questions about what all this means. Paul is by far the smartest person on nationalities and probably the world, not just in this country. And so I have great respect for his views on this. I'm just not certain we know fully what's going on inside the Kremlin and in Moscow itself.
David, I agree that we don't know. I was only speaking to the issue of how people outside the ring road see things. And their perceptions are increasingly clear, even if they're wrong. But people act on what their perceptions are, not on what the truth is. And so my concern is that there are people who really do believe that history is on their side. And the question is, how will they react to what we do or don't do? What worries me is that we may make the same mistake we made in 1918, and that we will see a Russian government that will do what Lenin did, using patriotism of a kind to suppress other people. I completely agree with you. We don't know what's going on inside the Kremlin. I do believe very strongly, however, that Russian politics is a whole lot bigger than just what goes on in the Kremlin, and that it's my fear, and it's the same fear I had 35 years ago at the end of Soviet times, is that we ignore what's going on outside the Kremlin or outside the ring road at our peril, because sometimes things happen that the center doesn't notice or doesn't understand or reacts in ways that make things worse. I actually believe I've seen some articles in some of the regional media raising questions about the enormous sums of money that are being talked about in the Prigozhin PMC situation. When people start asking those kinds of questions, it changes how they see the world. And I don't disagree with you at all that we don't know. I would not presume to speak about where Putin is. I do think it's important, however, that we remember that a lot of people there are going to act on the basis of how they think Putin is. And that understanding, that knowledge is something which we haven't devoted, in my view, enough time to finding out about.
I agree with you, Paul. And I wrote in the piece that Nadia referred to, the line that came up during 2011 with the Arab Spring, which is these regimes seem stable until they're not, and we never quite know what the tipping point is. And some of the centrifugal forces may tip things in a different way. I mean, launching an unprovoked war was not the smartest thing Putin ever did. It's been a horrible thing for Ukraine, of course, but he's turned Russia into as you said, a failed state, a disaster. And you could argue it happened well before, but the isolation of Russia, the cost of so many Russians who have been killed in this, that's not dismissing at all what's happening in Ukraine, of course. But I agree that Putin has unleashed, I think, forces that he may not be able to control.
David, if I might ask you to maybe say a few words. I mean, you have throughout your career been working with the Russian opposition. And while I ask you about what is happening with our friend and colleague, Vladimir Kara-Murza, right, and the Vilnius. So what do you see in terms of what's happening in that part of Russia?
I think, to be blunt, it's quite beleaguered. A number of the leaders of the opposition are in prison. Others have been forced to leave the country. Others have been killed. Boris Nemtsov, of course, in 2015. And it's a bit divided, I would say, and that's understandable. It's hard to maintain unity under such conditions, and particularly when the regime will target you, whether you're inside the borders of Russia or you're beyond the borders of Russia. The reports of poisoning of Russian activists and journalists in parts of Europe. And so it's a regime that does not handle threats lightly. It tries to make or turn targets into messages for others. They go after one or a couple, the others will get the message. Just like the arrest of Khodorkovsky in 2003 was a signal to all the other oligarchs: get in line or you'll be next in the cell next to Khodorkovsky. So, but I do think it's important to try to support liberal-minded Russians, and they exist, including inside the country. I would say that encouraging defections among Russians who are being forced to go fight is something that we should be more actively engaged in, and welcoming Russians as part of the brain drain that Putin has caused, I think, is also in our interest. So I think it is important to try to support those Russians who are opposed to the regime, opposed to the war, while recognizing the very difficult circumstances that they're operating in.
Paul, you were talking about what we did or didn't do. Well, the break of the Soviet Union, my recollection is that really that there were efforts that were wanting to hold the Soviet Union to hold together. Lots of some efforts expanded to prop up and support Gorbachev. And I think partly that was because we did not really understand what was going on, let's say, within Ukraine, right? 93% of the people voted for independence on December 1st. We completely, I think, missed that, understanding what was taking place regarding different disillusionment with the center, be it Chernobyl, be it mothers of Afghan soldiers and the like. I think part of the thing also maybe we're missing is what is happening. You're talking about now, people are talking about the enormous amounts of money, right, that have been wasted or given to Prigozhin. But then also now what the impact is of families who are questioning why their sons, right, have been taken to fight, right, in Ukraine and don't come back.
Well, you're certainly right. We didn't get it right in large number in 91. I mean, one can't forget that on August 1st, the president of the United States at the time went to Kiev and told the Ukrainian people that the pursuit of independence was a form of suicidal nationalism. Right. A line which is infamous and will remain an infamous one. It is the fact is, as David has correctly pointed out, our policy is always going to be centered on making sure that there's control of nuclear weapons. And because any vociferousness threatens that possibility, there will be a tendency to support any central government. And one of the problems that arises from that is that we often support people who call themselves Russian liberals, whose own policies with respect to large swaths of the population inside the borders of their own country is anything but liberal. In fact, it's as imperialist as the Kremlin. My biggest problem with the Russian liberal opposition is that it's not liberal at all when it comes to the people of the North Caucasus or the Middle Volga or any number of other places. They don't see those peoples as having rights of their own. And let us be blunt, that is a view which is widely shared by a large number of Americans who wrap it up with maintaining a single country is the best way to maintain single control over nuclear weapons. So these two things feed each other. I think we need to know a whole lot more. I certainly would agree with David that we should be encouraging the Russian opposition, but we should be encouraging the Russian opposition to recognize other oppositions that exist within their own country, as the current liberal Russian opposition often doesn't. It used to be said in Soviet times that Russian liberalism stopped at Ukraine. Now it could be said, since Ukraine is an independent country, that Russian liberalism stops a whole lot sooner at any number of non-Russians inside the Russian Federation. I didn't believe at the time that we could stop the Soviet Union from coming apart. I tend to believe we won't be able to stop the Russian Federation from coming apart, although probably not as completely, not as quietly, and coming apart with vastly more violence than was the case 30 years ago. But we better understand what's going on, and that means understanding that English-speaking Russian liberals are not the only game in town. And unfortunately, there's an awful lot of commentary in this country and discussion in the political class that acts as if they are. I admire many of these people. They're heroes. But on certain issues, they aren't liberal at all. And one of the biggest issues has to do with minorities. We can't decide that some minorities are privileged and other minorities aren't going to be, but unfortunately, that's the case.
Okay, so I've just been reminded, David, you have a hard stop at 11.
I do too. I do too.
Both of you do. Okay, so I better get to a few questions. So we have one from Victor Rud. Please comment on the assumption built in the U.S. fear that we would be in war with Russia. That is, what has happened to any remnants of mutual deterrence? Why wouldn't Russia be afraid of war with 31 nations that represent more than half the world economy? And what does this telegraph to China at all?
David, you want to take that first?
Sure. I'll give a shot. I think Victor is getting at his own answer, which is, I think Putin is afraid of direct conflict with NATO. Other than the 2007 cyber attack against Estonia, there really hasn't been any overt attacks on NATO member states. And I think the reason Putin attacked Ukraine for the second time, and the reason he attacked Georgia in 2008, is because they are not members of NATO. I agree with Victor that I think we have to understand that we have a lot of weight and leverage in this relationship, and should not be self-deterred by fears of escalation, that Putin will use a tactical nuclear weapon or he'll do some other thing. We need to recognize that we together as a NATO alliance, but the United States on its own, are the greatest military power in the world, and we should act like it. And I think Putin has, for all of his faults and gross misunderstandings of the West, miscalculation about how the West would respond to the invasion, he does have some respect for NATO. And I think we should appreciate that and use that more, so that we are not tying our hands behind our back, not delaying decisions on weapon systems and other support for Ukraine that it needs.
I'd just like to add to that. One of the things that's made me sad about Vilnius coverage is that there is an assumption that Article 5 is automatic, that if any country attacks a NATO member, the alliance immediately goes to war. That's simply not what Article 5 says. Article 5 says that an attack on one will be viewed as an attack on all, and there will be a meeting of the political committee to decide how to respond. This issue, where one country that will eventually become a member, namely Ukraine, is at war with Russia, is a slightly different situation. But the whole notion that if we took Ukraine in, that would put us in a state of war is not what the Washington Treaty says, and that's important to understand, because we would not be at war, or at least any more at war with Russia if Ukraine were taken in than if it weren't. What worries me is that there are some people who, having heard that the West will take Ukraine in after the war, will redouble efforts to promote a land for peace strategy, that Ukraine will get into the alliance if it only will end the war by making territorial concessions. I hope Ukrainians will stand firm and not do that, but I suspect that one of the things that will happen after Vilnius is that we're going to see, well, if the Ukrainians will just agree to end the war the way Putin wants by making territorial concessions, then the West will take Ukraine into NATO, and there'll be a new level of stability. I think that's going to happen. I think that's going to be something we're going to be talking about in the coming months, and it's worrisome because it's so superficially seductive and it's so destructive of both NATO and Ukraine.
Can I just reinforce Paul's point, because it's so important? I'm sorry, which is that the Ukrainians have agency in this, and those that Paul identified who are pushing for compromises, for concessions, are denying what the Ukrainians want by huge majorities. The Ukrainians reject concessions, territorial concessions, compromises. They don't trust any agreements with Putin for good reason. And so we have to recognize that it's the Ukrainians who are the ones who are doing the fighting and tragically the dying, and they have a say in this. The other point, just very quickly, is that if we say we won't let Ukraine in until the war ends, we are giving Putin further incentive to continue the war as long as possible. We, I think, have to say there is going to be an X date set when Ukraine will become a member of NATO. And when Ukraine becomes a member of NATO, if Putin continues the war, he will be at war with NATO. I think otherwise there is an incentive to just continue this endlessly. Whether Putin has the ability to sustain an operation is a different issue, but I think it sends the wrong signal to Moscow and to Kyiv.
Okay, so to maintain marital harmony, I will read a question from Robert McConnell.
Oh,
yes. So if we could say that by the end of Wednesday, Ukraine had gotten some good news at the summit, but it wasn't the United States exposed in many ways, embarrassingly, to be no longer leader of the free world, and that they let it be known then when they were criticized by Zelensky that the United States, thought about pulling out all references of Ukraine in the communique, like some petulant student government, and then admitting it was shocked by the support Ukraine had gotten in Vilnius, again exposing Washington had not been listening to the allies for months. What is the status of the U.S. at the end of the summit? In 30 seconds.
NATO, the NATO used to be said it was our alliance because we paid for it. NATO is a stronger alliance today in that it is a grouping of more than 30 democratic countries that share values. The United States is not the only country that matters. What makes NATO strong is that there is agreement among those countries. If one wants to argue that the United States has not paid adequate attention to some of NATO member states, I think that's a fair position to take. At the same time, the fact that the United States does take that into consideration in making decisions, I think is evidence of the strength of the alliance and not its weakness. And while I wanted Ukraine to be taken in, and hope it will be very soon, I think that the unity of NATO is overwhelmingly more important, and that's been preserved and enhanced. Anyway, thank you very much.
Okay,
Nadia,
David.
I have to go.
Nadia, thank you. No, nothing to add. I think Paul said it very well. So thank you very much. And Paul,
thank
it's
you
good
both.
to see you again.
And we look forward to getting together again.
Thank you.
Bye.